Hello, fellow Star Trek fans. Welcome back to a brand new episode of The War Room brought to you as part of the Clonestar podcast. I am your host, Mike Overton, and joining me in the co host seat this week is my wonderful friend and island show. Show, how are you doing this week?
Bad, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Now, our guest this week, we are joined by an incredible actor, yoga instructor, former ballet dancer, podcast host, and a wildly curious person. You might know her from The Expanse, Murdoch Mysteries, as well as her podcast Gratitude and Growth, or also know her as Ariam or Nilsson on Star Trek Discovery. We are delighted to welcome Sara Mitich to the show. Sara, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and chat everything with you guys.
It's always
Uh,
fun. Just to have a nice chat, and especially to talk to a fellow podcaster, as what I'm going to call
Yes.
podcaster,
Pod
podcaster.
podcaster.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll go with
Yeah.
podcaster. That sounds better.
and Sarah, you might have also noticed we blatantly stole your introduction from your own show as well, I might add, because you
did.
open up
Yeah,
every
well
episode
done.
by an actor, a yoga instructor, and a farmer, ballet dancer. So I said we'd introduce you the way you introduce yourself.
No, I love that. Thank you. I mean, I feel like that's always the safest thing to do, so
Yeah.
I
I mean,
think
Steve
that,
Jobs turned around and said theft is the greatest form of flattery.
I thought it was
accurate.
imitation was the sincerest form of flattery, no?
No theft. Because, I mean, Apple stole the computer mouse from IBM. So,
Mike, are you in danger of getting this entire show cancelled by
Like, this
Apple
is going
fans? for what
down
you
a
just
different
said?
path.
it's fine. He also did say, why join the Navy when you can be a pirate? So, who knows?
Sarah, going back to the start, long before all the days of kind of podcasting and acting and things like that, did you grow up in say, a creative household, or what was it that was a creative spark for you initially?
Yeah. So, I mean, yes and no, in the sense of I have two older sisters. We were all kind of creative in our own way. And my parents were always really supportive of that. But my parents themselves weren't necessarily creative in the sense of they came to Canada from Serbia. I was the first one born there. And so, we had an immigrant family lifestyle. My parents worked really hard. They worked multiple jobs. And so they didn't really have the luxury of and time to be creative. It was kind of more like work, work, work to pay the bills. But I was a ballet dancer for most of my childhood and my teens. And so that was my creative outlet. I remember, I think I was 4, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table, and my mom had me and my one sister, and she was like, okay, what do you girls want to do? Like, what do you want to do with your life? And I was like, I want to be a prima ballerina. And that set off an entire trajectory that defined like the first 18 years of my life. I was in baby ballet, and then I really started focusing in ballet. And then when I discovered that the National Ballet School of Canada existed, I was like, I want to get in there. What do I need to do? And so my ballet teacher at the time was like, okay, you need to start taking 2 levels at once. Because this was just like a smaller dance studio. And this was the National Ballet School of Canada. They only accept 20 people. So it's like, so I started doing it all. And then I auditioned and I got in, and then I moved there. It's a boarding school. So I moved there when I was 9. And so that just amplified it, right? And that was like a beautiful, beautiful blend of creativity and discipline together for me. So yes, creativity was always there. Not necessarily facilitated like through my parents, but always supported by them.
So, are you the youngest in your family then, Sarah?
I am.
Ah, so you're like me. So the question is, do the youngest child always get the hardest kind of rap in that kind of situation? Like, because I always hear older kids say, oh no, it's hardest being the oldest. I maintain it's hardest
Definitely
being the
harder being
youngest.
the oldest.
No, it's not. It's hardest being the youngest, Mike. I know what you're talking about. Me and Sarah fully agree that it's harder being the youngest. Isn't that right, Sarah?
So I think I'm going to play it safe here, but also honest. I think each position, youngest, eldest, middle, has its trials and has its benefits. Honestly, for me, it was just weird because I moved out when I was 9 and I came back when I was like, I don't even fully remember, 15, 16. And so it was suddenly like, hey, the youngest child was gone to this like fancy ballet school. And then whoa, the fancy ballet school kid is back now. So it was like, it was,
So your
my
parents
family,
held it
yeah.
against you, right? Okay, we got that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was an interesting family dynamic, I can tell you that. So
And at your best, Sarah, without being arrogant, how good were you at being a ballerina?
I was really good. So I was on a full scholarship almost. And, they were kind of molding me to be at a certain level. And, like I'd film documentaries for my feet with like Martine Lamy and Karen Kane, who were like two of the top primas. And it was going very well. I was very confident. I was like, this is what I'm going to do. But then I grew. I grew like 5 or 6 inches in 8 months. And I dislocated both my knees. I busted my lower back. I ended up in physio for a year, uh, literally rebuilding the muscles from my toes to my neck. Like I remember I couldn't walk very well there for a while. So I would go to all the academic classes and lay on the floor on a mat. Like my lower back, it was rough. It was rough. And so, yeah. And then the day I sat with the artistic director to go back to classes, ballet classes, because it had been I think almost a year at that point. That night I was rushed to the hospital with a very complicated case of appendicitis. So I was like, I think this is my body. Yeah. Being like, hey, you need to slow down a little bit. Um,
Your body's
yeah,
definitely giving you the middle finger there, isn't it? Going, no,
yeah,
no more, no
yeah.
more.
Yeah. But honestly, it's all I wanted to do. It's all I knew how to do, truly. And then so when that was gone, I was again like 15. So like amongst like the teenage hormones, and suddenly it's like the thing I've been doing my whole life is now gone. And so yeah, it was wild. But to answer your question, I was pretty damn good. Just gonna say.
So was it was it an injury that caused the issues, or was it actually kind of like a kind of a build-up of kind of like, pushing your body to the absolute extreme that kind of, eventually led to the knees and the back going on you?
So it was a blend. So it was the growth spurt. So my bones were growing so much faster than my ligaments and my muscles. So like I don't know if this will like gross people out, but like my right kneecap would not stay in. Like I would take a step on the stair and it would like dislocate and I'd pop it back in. One time it dislocated while I was sleeping. It was just like literally my body and we didn't realize it at first. And we had like 6 hours of physical training a day. So like when you don't realize something's going on, right? Like, so I think it was a perfect storm of everything. And then after the dislocations, my knee cartilage was just never the same. Look, that being said, I'm so blessed. I never actually tore any ligaments.
Yeah.
I didn't tear my ACL. I didn't like none of that. And that is such a blessing. But the spinal injury, like 2 vertebrae in my lumbar spine shifted a millimeter, like just 1 millimeter, but that's a millimeter of your spine. So it's like, but that was just growth. Like my spine was growing so fast. So yeah, it was a blend. It was a blend of it all. And I think again, it was just also the universe being like, okay, we gotta redirect a little bit.
What? So this is finding the episode of the podcast where we can start comparing like long-term scars and injuries. I was always waiting for someone to kind of break the mold and tell us they were badly injured. We can start talking about that. Sarah, that's like, good Lord, it's awful. Like I know that you're telling it in a kind of humorous way, but my God, that sounds absolutely horrendous. So you arrive kind of back home, and it's almost like an artist who's kind of given up on kind of music is kind of coming home, breaking down the front door with a massive cigarette in their mouth, going, "I've had enough of this. I've had enough of people." When you kind of realized that the ballerina dream is over, what did you kind of think coming back home? Did you feel like it was a defeat, or did you say, "I'm going to pick myself up. I'm going to do this again," or did you say, "Do you know what? The ballerina dream is over. It's time to knuckle down and think about the next plan"?
No, I was so depressed. I was so depressed, honestly. My mother is one of my favorite people in my life for so many reasons, but this was one of them. Of, at the ballet school, they wake you up with a PA system. They put you to bed by coming around and turning off your lights, and every single hour in between is scheduled. from morning till night. You don't get free time. Your parents can't just come visit you. They have to come, ask permission, sign you out. You can't go out without a chaperone. You are literally, it is, we always joke that it's military school, but our boys wore thongs and tights. That's literally the only difference. You know, like if your hair wasn't in a good enough bun or a ponytail, or if your uniform wasn't worn properly, you have detention the next day at 8 a.m. Like it was so strict.
Wow.
And this is what I mean. It really blended creativity with mental discipline. And to be honest, mental discipline I'll hold on to for my entire life. But no, going back was so hard because suddenly I had no idea who I was or who I was supposed to be. And on top of that, the academics at the ballet school were so much farther ahead than the public school that I had transferred to. Also, the ballet school has 140-ish students from grades 5 to 12 in the middle of the gay area of Toronto. It was like such an environment. And then I transitioned to this public, kind of rough high school in the city that had 2,500 people from grades 9 to 12,
Yeah.
where you wore ID tags. And like, you know, there was like theft, there was stabbings, there was everything. And so the transition alone was so different for me. I was totally a fish out of water. The people that I'd gone to school with previously in grade 4, you know, were still there, but I hadn't kept in contact with most of them. And on top of it all, I'd finish school at 3 o'clock. I'd get home and I'd have nothing to do. So I'd actually have panic attacks. What I realize now are panic attacks, but my mom actually noticed it. And so she actually like created projects for me to do around the house. And now I can see it as an adult, but like she so saw it, you know, like she totally saw it. And then, yeah, she just really helped guide me. And I went back to ballet classes just in a local studio. And I did that for a couple years throughout high school, but it wasn't obviously the same. And then eventually though, so after I got back, I was like, I'm gonna become a physiotherapist because I now know how to do everything with the body because I just spent all this time. So I was gonna become a physiotherapist. And that's what I was gonna be. But then I got into the drama club and got on stage and I was like, okay, I really love theater. I really like, you know, you can't take it out of me. I was performing my whole life, but I also really loved physics and calculus. Like I loved math. You know, I always say this, if I wasn't an actor, I'd be an accountant. Like I love doing my taxes. It's one of my favorite times. I love sitting there and going through all the receipts and doing all the calculations. Like numbers make me very happy because they're very safe. They're very objective, black or white, right or wrong, you know?
Literally sounds like my worst nightmare. I'm
That's what a lot of
the
people
complete
say.
opposite. I am so creative and I love everything that isn't black and white.
Actually,
Yeah, no,
like Sarah, when you were saying about going home and your mother giving you tasks, I was just reminded of the episode of The Simpsons when there's no teachers left in the school and Lisa is stuck at home and she's going crazy. So Marge keeps giving her projects to do, and I was there going, "That sounds like what happened to Sarah in that
yeah,
situation."
yeah, totally, totally.
I
But
have to ask, you brought up one other thing I have to quickly ask you about. In the ballet school, you said there was detention if things were done badly. Sarah, how many times were you sent to detention?
maybe one. I don't really remember. I usually played by the rules. I was very, you know, I was always very like, but I always had that thing of this is what I want. And so, you know, whether I call that like my competitive nature or whatever it is, but my whole life I was always like, if I want something, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And I also knew what it cost me to get in this school. And on top of it, I knew, even though I was on a big scholarship, what it's costing my parents for me to be in this school. So I always took it very seriously. But yeah, I can't really remember. So I don't think it happened often.
And just out of curiosity, how good are you at ballet still today?
You know, I'm pretty good. A lot of my first breakthrough roles were all like the Russian ballerina because I'm Serbian and I'm a ballerina. But so flat-footed, very well, especially if I was to like go into class every day for a month. But on point, that is when I book roles that are a ballet dancer. I just tell them up front. I'm like, if you want me on point, I can't do like an entire pas de deux on point. I can fake it really well and you can get a double for me, but I'm not going to sit here and attempt to do like 12 flattes on point and break my ankle because those muscles, like it's actually now in yoga, my weakest thing in the balancing poses. The muscles in your ankle, those stabilizer muscles, are very, very, very fine. And if you don't train them, like on point, if you don't train those stabilizer muscles, your feet can look really good. Like my feet look really good in point, but they're so flexible and like wobbly. It's like a gazelle that like just gave birth to a baby and the baby's like, I don't know what my limbs are, you know?
You see, a part of me wants to challenge you, Sarah, to see how good you are at ballet right now. But I'd be terrified that like you'd stand up and break an ankle, and we'd be there going, "We can never release this episode. We never spoke to Sarah under any
Don't Stop
circumstances."
podcast gets sued by Sarah.
Yeah, well, I'll stay seated. It's good. You can just take my word for it.
So you started taking acting lessons. You got up on stage. Where did the thrill come from you in that?
Yeah, so I never saw myself doing film and TV. Fun fact. I always thought it would be theater because it's what I was used to. And I miss it sometimes a lot because you have that immediate response, the energetic response from an audience. You have the fact that you can't just cut yourself. You can't do multiple takes of the same thing every night. There's that anticipation and the nerves and the give over to the authenticity of the moment of it's going to be what it's going to be and the magic of all the players doing that, right? So that for me, that spark, I've always loved playing make believe since I was a kid. I love diving into characters, building characters, finding what makes them tick, figuring out who they are, why they're like that, why they're reactive here, defensive here. That's why, also I started the podcast, which I'm sure we'll get to, but I have this fascination with human behavior, with the human psyche, which is like, why do we do what we do? Why? And so I've had that since I was a kid. And so theater, I was able to indulge in that part of obviously character analysis, building a character, creating a character, but then also melding it with who I am, because that's the funnest part for me. And that's why, I love doing all the roles. I'm such a chameleon in all the roles I do. Like it's something my team always tells me. They're like, you are a chameleon. You can literally do like high level sitcom to like nitty gritty drama. And I do it all authentically because I have all those parts of me. And so for me, acting is amazing because I get to explore me. I get to explore me. And sometimes people, you know, they'll be like, well, I can't connect with this character because I could never kill a child, so I can't connect with them.
Yep.
And I'm like, look, sure, I don't think I could ever kill a child, but I tell you this right now, if maybe killing the child's a wrong thing.
So
Because I'm thinking about that right now. We're gonna back this up. Let's just killing a person in general. Because I'm like, I can't. That's a hard one, and that'll take a long time for me to rewire. But let's say killing somebody, right? Sure, day to day, I'm like, I don't think I could ever hurt somebody because I operate from such a magnitude of love. But let's say somebody's holding a knife up to my niece. You bet I would go after them and do whatever I needed to do to protect her, So I think that's why the child thing was in my head, by the way. I was thinking of an analogy that could work. But
Could you imagine if somebody just dived into the podcast and just came to this moment in the podcast and they're saying, listening to Sarah's they're listening to an episode of Sarah's podcast going, oh, it's all wonderful, growth and meditation, fantastic. And then listen to this going, oh my God, what's going on here?
I know.
What kind of person is this?
I know. Yeah. We all have so many facets to us. Anyway, but so I loved creating characters. I loved all of that. And like, that's what sparks it for me. And then I kind of fell into film and TV in a wild, random way. But that career took off faster than the theater did. So here I am.
What were some of the performances on the stage that you really enjoyed doing? Like, what were some of the characters that you enjoyed playing most?
Yeah. So, I always loved classical text as well. I mean, we did 12th Night and I loved that. Um, there was a couple different plays in theater school that we did. One was called Widows. And honestly, I don't fully remember it, but I just remember it was like in our little black box theater. And it was just like a story of these women and everything that they had gone through. And so the performance of that one always stuck with me because it was very dramatic, very impactful. Um, those are the ones that stand out for me. I mean, I'd always love to do more classical. In Ontario, we have two theater groups, I guess you could call them, or just festivals, the Shaw Festival and the Stratford Festival. And it's more classical text. And I think there's something beautiful in that because they've been around for so long and just, yeah, to be able to do 12th Night again as an adult too, or just like, Romeo and Juliet, like these classical texts that have been around for so long, that would be so great for me.
But how did you find, say, memorizing the Shakespearean dialogue? Because it's not that easy.
Yeah, I'm blessed with a really good memory. So that's just something everybody always asks me. But for me, the key is understanding what I'm saying,
Mm.
right? If I can actually understand, and this goes down to text analysis, right? Of like, what's the purpose? What's the intention behind the line? If I can understand that, then it's just almost kind of learning a bit of a new language, which I mean, like I had to learn English. So once you can learn English, I feel like any other language is so easy to learn. So that's kind of how I look at it. And same thing with The Expanse, right? I had to learn an entire new language. I was there when they were creating it.
Yeah.
And not only that, it was like a new verbal language, but also a physical language that goes with it. So also something I'm super fascinated with is accents, languages, like all that kind of stuff.
I was about to ask you, when you grew up then at home, was Serbian the kind of primary language that you spoke in the
Mhm.
house? So how good
Yeah,
is your Serbian still today?
it's pretty good. So I can right now it's because especially because I'm not living
Yeah.
close to home, I don't speak it as much, but it's totally still there. Like if I was to especially go to Serbia and immerse myself for a week or two, it would come back a lot. I do have a bit of a Canadian accent sometimes now when I speak Serbian, but again, after an hour or two, it kind of like starts going away.
And you said then that you fell into TVs and movies. Like, how did you fall into them, or was it a kind of a plan to go into them, or did it just an opportunity arise and you said, you know what, I'm going to chance my arm, I'm going to give it a go and see what happens, and then it kind of led into it, or what happened?
Yeah, so my last semester of theater school, we had like a 6-week introduction to film and TV. And I took it not thinking anything of it, but I fell in love with the intimacy of film and TV, which is something you don't get in theater. Suddenly I was like, ooh, I can like just literally be nose to nose with an acting partner and like do the scene here. I don't have to project and reach the back wall of a 3,000 person theater. And so I was like, oh, there's something here that I love, but it's a totally different muscle set than theater. You maybe character analysis and stuff is similar, but execution is completely different. And so I was like, okay, I think I want to do this. But also my film instructor at the time, you know, this was actually part of my gratitude challenge this month that I did on the podcast, but not on the podcast, but just for the podcast. But I think there's people in your life that sometimes say something and it's so simple, but the impact that it has on you changes your life. And sometimes we know both ends of the spectrum, right? Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. And my film instructor at the time, I was emailing assignments, something, and I asked something, and he just responded with such a simple line in the email being like, I'm not sure why, but I believe in you. I think you could really do the film and TV thing if you wanted to. And I was like, ooh, And I'll never forget that moment because I'll never forget that email. And and it wasn't even like that was the whole email. It was like, we were talking about assignments, whatever, but he capped it with that. And suddenly, it inspired faith that I could do this because I wanted to, but it was something so different. And like, I didn't know how to get an agent. Like, I didn't know any of this. And so it kind of propelled me on this path. And so when I graduated theater school, I actually dove right into an acting studio, like a private film and TV acting studio. And I started training there. And then my teachers there, my mentor there kind of took me from theater actor to a film and TV actor. And the agent that I signed with repped me for both. But then film and TV, I started getting more bites on that faster. And it's really hard to do both at the same time. The commitments are it's too much to coexist.
Yep.
So I just kind of let the snowball take over.
And when you started on that journey then, Sarah, did you kind of say to yourself, that's it, I want to be on specific TV shows, I want to be in the movies, or what was it? Or were you just kind of more, I'm just going to go with the flow and see which way the wind takes me?
Yeah, I always really was drawn to the nitty-gritty human roles, like the dark, again, exploring the darker parts of our humanity. Like Charlize Theron in Monster is probably one of my favorite roles. Like that level of humanity. Natalie Portman in Black Swan. I mean, that's a dream role for a million different reasons, but just studying, really diving into these darker parts of us. And because I think we all struggle with certain things. And I think that's one reason why people go and watch these very profound movies, because they can relate, they can see something in themselves. And I think that to me is the trait of a good actor. And that for me is something, I mean, Charlize Theron in Monster, you love Eileen. You love her, even whatever she's doing. That's like a perfect example of what I was saying earlier. Like, you don't think you could kill someone, right? You don't think you could love somebody who does that, but you see what she's doing and you see the motivators and you see everything, that it's such a three-dimensional character. And it inspired me so much. And I was like, yes, I want to find those three-dimensional characters in those stories that kind of shake people up a little bit. That being said, I've done some Hallmark movies. I've done some movies of the week, and I love them. I love to love. I love doing also the feel-good movies that let you turn your brain off and you can just enjoy. I mean, I'm an entertainer as well. So that too is something I'm passionate about. And one thing, I talk to my team about a lot is I never want to be pigeonholed into one thing. I want to be able to keep doing it all for my entire career. I want to do this and then jump to that and then surprise people. I was doing a couple interviews. I did this movie Control a couple of years ago, and so that character's name is also Eileen. And when that movie came in and I read it, I was like, this is a dream role. This is exactly what I've always wanted to do. And I was doing some interviews for that, and somebody asked me, they're like, you've really become like a sci-fi darling, like a sci-fi indie darling, because you keep doing these sci-fi things. Did you ever expect that? I was like, no. Growing up, I was more fantasy than I was sci-fi. Like I'm a book nerd. I've always been a book nerd. So I was all about like, I don't know, give me Harry Potter, give me Miss of Avalon, like give me like all these different, um, things I could escape to, my mind could escape to. But sci-fi has become, this pocket for me, and I'm not upset about it at all, because the sci-fi world is so wonderful and accepting and expansive, and again, like allows you to question humanity in such a beautiful way. I mean, Star Trek, right? Like it's always pushing the limits, exploring internally and externally everything about what makes us human, what doesn't, what makes us accepting, what doesn't. So I love that. In sci-fi, yeah, it's been this wonderful thing that I'm kind of navigating my way around. And that's why it's also super cool, because I'm at a point where I'm like, I'm so curious what the next thing is going to be. you
And
know?
do you like the challenge of that then, not knowing what the next thing is going to be and wanting to be surprised in such a way that the next opportunity makes you take on something you mightn't have considered before?
Yeah, always. Always. And you know, being an actor can be so hard sometimes, the unknown. But it's not just being an actor, right? It's life. Everybody faces the unknown. It's the thing we fear the most, right? Because this is where it's like we want to be able to control things. So I'm at a point where I'm like, I do the best I can with everything that I do. And honestly, the rest isn't up to me. And so, yeah, sometimes I'm sitting here being like, ooh, I don't know what's going to be next. I don't know if it's just going to be like a 4 6 week movie. I don't know if it'll be another like 5 6 year TV show that films half the year. Like I have no idea. And so it will destroy you as an artist if you let those times of the unknown spiral you down. And I know because I've been there, right? So it's like you can get into these places where it's like, I don't know what my next job is. And like, I'm going to rip apart my life and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And you can spiral down. I've learned to take these times to fuel other creative passions that I have, but also sit in them with excited anticipation of what could be next instead of when is the next thing going to come. It's like, okay, cool. It's going to come at the right time because it always does. And I wonder what it's going to be.
So, Sarah, in terms of then kind of moving on from that a bit, like you have a podcast, the Growth and Gratitude podcast, but obviously that doesn't suddenly appear out of nowhere. There's obviously
Mhm.
got to be big lead in, but also an interest from, say, whatever, a young age or say teenage or whatever it is. When did you start really kind of focusing on, say, mental health and say mentality and all this kind of stuff? What was it that kind of attracted you to it?
Yeah. So a few things. So it happened in like one chapter, probably like 10 years ago now. And then I'd always come back to it. And so ever since a kid, I've been, like I said, so curious about just like who we are, like philosophically and like why we're here. Why am I here? Like, why do I exist? I remember when I was a kid, I asked my mom one day in the car, I think I was like 8, and I was like, Mommy, why can't I hear or know your thoughts? Like, why do I only hear my thoughts? Like, why don't I hear your thoughts? Why is this my story? And I don't even know what she said, but I don't know how to explain that to a child. But that, like, that's a perfect definition of like, that's been my life. And so I've always been curious. And then I read The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle like 10, 12 years ago. And it's a book on enlightenment. And I'm actually currently rereading it. I probably reread it every year. And it got me thinking about this separation of like mind, body, soul, and this separation of our thoughts are the root of our suffering. And I couldn't fully grasp it, to be honest with you, for like another couple years. And then I reread it and I'm like, oh, there's something here. Like, there's something here. I understand what it is to be present.
Mhm.
And I understand that like my thoughts are creating turmoil in my head sometimes, but I still couldn't understand it. And then about 3 years ago now, I went just through a massive shift in my life. I ended a long-term relationship. I canceled my wedding 6 weeks before it was supposed to happen. Um, and it propelled me into like the greatest state of depression. And I talk about this on the podcast. Like before that depression, for the first time in my life, like I was drunk or high every day for like an entire summer that I wasn't working at like the days I wasn't working. And that was never me. I was always like perfect Patsy Sarah who like
Never got
sometimes drank.
detention in ballet school, was always good and got her things done in ballet school. That's the
Exactly.
important thing to remember.
Yeah, exactly. And so suddenly I was like, forget it all. I'm just gonna like let loose and I'm gonna have this freedom. And it was freeing and it was freedom, but it wasn't the healthiest way of dealing with that kind of pain and dealing with being so unlikable suddenly. Suddenly, me, who was always liked by everyone, was so unlikable for this choice I made. And anyway, I mean, I don't know if you've listened to the first episode of the podcast, so I can talk about it. I don't know if your podcast has like PG-ness to it or whatnot, but
Oh no,
anyway,
completely not at
Nope.
all. Say whatever you want to say
okay,
here.
okay. One day I was super drunk and I did shrooms, and I had never done drugs really before, and it propelled me. I had the worst trip of my life, like put it that way, literally. And apparently I did them all wrong. I didn't know you're not supposed to do them when you're drunk. And anyway, whatever. It was terrible. And during that trip, I was like laying on my kitchen floor, screaming and sobbing, looking at my ceiling. And part of my ceiling was popcorn and part of it was smooth. And I just remember screaming, being like, which one am I supposed to be? The rough or the smooth? And my entire world broke out from under me. Literally, like all my demons came out. They all came out. Like my dad had died 9 years prior to this. I never really dealt with that death and what happened. Like all the stuff, all the ways I was abusing my physical body was coming out, and like just all these things, my fear of rejection, all of this started coming out. And it truly like propelled me into the deepest depression, like the deepest depression I've ever had, because like more than the ballet school, more than after my dad died, because like this one was of my own doing, you know? And sometimes that one's the hardest, but through that came like, it was like a perfect opportunity to really indulge in all these questions I had about myself, because I realized I hated myself. I realized I wasn't showing up how I wanted to in life, like in the smallest ways and the biggest ways. I was like, why do I always feel like I need to prove myself? No matter what room I'm in, why do I always feel like I need to prove myself? Or why am I always competing with the women in the room? Like, where is all this coming from? Why don't I feel confident? Why do I hate my body? Why do I, like all of this stuff. And it was this moment where I was either going to like let myself spiral into like this crazy depression, or I was going to tie up the laces and be like, this is it. Like, figure it out, become the person you want to be. And I was like, okay, I choose that. I don't know how. I was like, I don't know how to do this. And so this is where all these books that I had previously read, like Power of Now, all these other things, and things I had dabbled with throughout my life, meditation, yoga, this, I really just took a deep dive into personal development, into the mind, body, soul connection. I read a bunch of books, everything from mindset methods, personal development, to spirituality, enlightenment. Like I jumped my entire life from religion to religion. When I was in high school, I was like, I'm pagan. And then suddenly I was like doing Bible studies and like into Catholicism and then into Buddhism. And like I'd always swing because I was always so curious. I was like, I know there's something more, but I don't get it. I don't get what it's supposed to be. And so I spent a couple years really studying all of it. Here, I went to Bali for a month. I lived in silence for 11 days. I like studying Eastern philosophy, culture, everything, and just kind of with no agenda, truly with no agenda besides how do I become the person I want to be? And so I spent a couple of years doing that. And then I was I'd always talk to my friends about what was happening. And I was like, hey, I'm learning this about like our mental process, and like I'm learning where these roots come from. And I started talking to them about what I was learning, my discoveries, the habits I was implementing every day, things that I was experiencing in meditation, in breathwork classes. And I saw it starting to change them. Like they started implementing these things. They started, quote unquote, bettering themselves, right? And they're like, hey, this inspires me to work on my reactivity, or like why my mom pisses me off, or look into, hey, this is like childhood trauma that's like still lingering around. Or, a big thing I talk about is just navigating grief, because I didn't for so many years. And so all of this stuff, like some of my friends also had like disordered eating and like punished their bodies. And so I was like, hey, so I've learned this comes out for me when I feel out of control. I try to take it out of my body because I feel like I'm in control. And I saw this beautiful effect it was having. And then, you know, maybe I should say this, maybe I shouldn't. But what happened first before the podcast is I actually wrote a book, which I don't know if I'll ever publish. I don't know if I'll ever publish it. That's where the podcast came from, was a year and a bit before I even did the podcast, I wrote a book. Over the course of like 60 days, it just like spewed out of me. And it was everything I had learned in those 2 years. And I read it whenever I feel like I'm spiraling, whenever I feel like I'm lost. It's like one long journal entry of all my truths.
Something to
And
reflect back on.
pardon?
Something to reflect back on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Almost to sort of
And
guide you through.
why would
Yeah.
you think you wouldn't publish it, Sarah?
You know, I don't know. I keep going through it, and I see if I do, I feel like it'll be later in life. And it's not fear. I ask myself, I'm like, is it fear that like people will judge me? And I'm like, no, the podcast is very personal. Like it's the most personal thing I've ever done as an actor, because I was always the actor who like kept my personal life on lock, because I also had, you know, certain people in certain higher positions being like, we love how quiet you are sometimes, and like you don't. And then I was like, well, here we go.
Fun fact. No.
Yeah. But I don't know. And it's nothing that's new or nothing that I haven't spoken about, but I don't know yet if it's just for me.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if the book's just for me or if it's meant for something greater. But
Yep.
so the podcast started with, finally, I was like, okay, I want to take these thoughts and these tools publicly, because ever since I was a child, I always had this thing. I'm like, I'm going to save the world. I'm going to save the world. Like, I don't know if it was my obsession with like fantasy or this, like, you know, the moment I understood like poverty and that there's countries, like third world countries, who don't have fresh water, I was like, I will fix it. That was very destructive for a chunk of my life, because you can't save people. You just can't. They have to save themselves. But the book, the podcast, it all came from this innate sense of to be of service to people and to give people these tools that had led me to such freedom, like inner freedom from mental suffering, from depression, from guilt and grief, that I was like, if I can help at least one person, just one person, I've done what I can do, you know?
It was funny when you were telling the story about when you were on mushrooms. Actually, Mike as well would have to put a disclaimer, because Sarah's talked about murdering people and doing mushrooms the wrong way. So, like, I don't know. Like, I think we're 2 strikes towards a 3-strike rule here for Sarah.
Warning, this episode contains graphic material. We do not condone any of the actions.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the story about when you were on the ground looking up at the ceiling, I was on a treadmill on the verge of death because I'm completely unfit, and I was looking up at a ceiling at the same time, going, I can understand where Sarah's coming from with this. When you wrote the book, Sarah, and as you're doing the podcast and things like that, what are you, or indeed have you learned about yourself as you've been going through this journey?
Yeah. It's so fascinating. The podcast has been my biggest growth to date. And the beautiful thing about growth is it's never ending. That's the most humbling realization I've had, is you can reach, like, 2022 for me was a year of such presence, and where all these tools I've learned about personal development, about your thoughts, your words, your actions, like and I was living it so intentionally, and I feel like I had healed so much of my triggers and my trauma. But I spent most of 2022 in solitude. So that was great. I needed that. But then 2023, I took that into like what I call like the real world. I took it out into the world, and I got into a relationship, and suddenly all this stuff that I thought I healed, suddenly it's like my partner's triggering things in me that I thought I healed. And I'm like, whoa, 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 reactive Sarah's coming out. And I thought this part of me was done. I thought this part of me was gone. And so launching the podcast, even though honestly it came as such inspired action, I never saw it being a podcast necessarily, but it was terrifying for me because I'd never spoken publicly about certain things in my life. In interviews, like literally people would ask me like certain things in interviews if ahead of time, and I'd be like, hey, on the day, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to answer this question. So you can tell me, you can send me a new question right now, or just know on the day, I'm not going to answer it.
Yeah.
Because I'd been so conditioned to like, keep your head down, be quiet, be likable, don't rock the boat. And suddenly I was like, hey, here's all this. And likability, no matter how much you try to condition yourself out of it, like it's still, as human beings, we want to belong.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And so the podcast for me, I was like, what are people going to think? Like, on top of it all, I'm talking about these things, but right now I'm like spiraling sometimes in my real life. And I'm like, is any of it real? Like, do these tools work? Like, how I feel so separate from it sometimes. And that's why I only ever recorded when I felt inspired to.
Yeah.
Mm.
Because to me, honestly, the podcast, it's for other people, but it's also for me. It's for me too, because when you talk about these things with other people, you give it back to yourself.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I want to talk about these concepts. I want to talk about these things. The fact that everything in your life is a choice, meditation, all of this, our judgment of others, the fact that I think everything comes from either fear or love. And so it's been my greatest growth. And even this season has been so cool because I'm doing interviews and I'm learning, as you probably know, every single interview is different and you can only plan it to a certain amount, but it's like holding the space for your guests to be authentic, but also you to be authentic. And what happens when sometimes your authenticity doesn't like blend as well as you expected, or, and so it's been this beautiful homecoming, but also this beautiful growth in just like speaking my truth with ownership. There's a very scary thing, not just for actors, honestly, for anybody nowadays, where, cancel culture is so huge right now.
Yeah.
And there's a part of me that's like, what if I change my mind in 5 years? What if you know what I mean? Like, what if one of my beliefs changes because I am forever evolving, whereas I used to meditate every single day for 45 minutes. And if anybody asked me 2 years ago, I'm like, that is the key to everything. Now I'm like, some days I'm lucky if I get 5 minutes. Like I do meditate every day, but some days it's 5 minutes. And, that's because I'm growing.
Yeah.
And so that's been a beautiful relinquishing of control because I don't know who I'm going to be in 2 years or the things I'm going to be talking about, but it's like, the podcast has been a beautiful growth in that and being like, hey, this is me, world. This is me right now. This is all of me. Take what you like, leave what you don't. I don't care. So,
One of the
yeah.
things I appreciated when I was listening to the podcast on Monday, and I think it was in episode 1, and you were saying that you could walk into a room and you'd be able to know straight away what people expected from you, and you could become that person kind of so easily. I'm wondering, as years have gone by, have you kind of started to say, no, do you know what? I am Sarah. This is who I am, and I'm not going to change that just to kind of suit you. It was funny in work yesterday. I was doing a presentation on business writing, and afterwards, someone came back and was talking to me about it, and they were saying, because one of the things I was talking about is try and be polite, try and be friendly in how you communicate. And I gave an example of when I did that at one point and it didn't go well. And the person was asking me, but how do you make sure it always goes well? And I said, well, you can't. I said, because you can only control one side of this, and that side is you. I said, you have no control over the other side at all. And I said, I'll put it like this. I said, if you met 3 people you've never met before, you could talk to 2 of them and they could respond positively to who you are. I said, but the third person mightn't. I said, you mightn't have changed in any way, shape, or form between talking to the first 2 and turning to the last person. I said, but they may not respond to it. So with what you were saying, do you kind of approach every situation going, I'm no longer doing that chameleon approach. I'm being me, and people can either accept me for who I am or not.
Yeah. Yes. The short answer to that is yes. There are times where I feel that pull to want a chameleon. I do. I'm human, right? Like I'll be in a room and I'm like, this isn't going how I thought it would go. And like I could totally morph and be who they want me to be, but I'm not going to. And that is a muscle that I've been training, because I think everything in life is like muscle memory. Like, you know what I mean? You gotta physically do things to build a certain muscle. You can't just think about having biceps without lifting weights. You know what I mean? So I have to keep practicing it. And yeah, so I don't do it nearly as much. And for the most part, I totally catch myself when I want to. And then I unpack it later to be like, okay, cool. I just felt like threatened or I felt unsafe, and that's okay. Right now, I'm at a point where I'm really able to like sit in my awareness, even when I feel myself spiraling, to be like, whoo, this person's like triggering all my insecurities. Okay, cool. Instead of being reactive, I'm just going to be quiet. So that's usually a safe bet. But yeah, it is. And it's exactly what you said of sometimes people like it and sometimes it's not that they don't like it. It's just they don't understand it. Like this is the kind of stuff I could talk for hours about. Like I geek out about the internal work. And what I've realized though is that some people just can't. And not because they don't want to, but because they need to decompress. And this for them isn't a decompress. I talk about it with one of my guests too, of like, gratitude is my way of life. Gratitude is everything for me. Honestly, it is everything for me. But sometimes people don't want that. Sometimes they just don't want it and they don't need it. And I've come to accept and understand that. And it goes back to the thing of like, sometimes when I first started doing all this work on myself and discovering all these things and like feeling this inner freedom, I tried to like give it to everybody. I was like, no, you're thinking so negatively. That's going to create a negative thing. And like right now you're spiraling because you're being triggered. And I'm like, that is not my place. It is not my place. Even though the intention is loving.
Yeah.
I'm not there. And there's still some people very close to me in my life who I can't talk about this with. I just
Yeah.
can't. And so the conversations become very surface,
Yeah.
and that's okay. It's okay, you know?
It's important to kind of recognize, I think, depending on the person you're speaking to, you might have a completely separate relationship, but you could care about them just as strongly, like someone that you can have really in-depth conversations with versus someone you just talk nonsense with and things like that. One of the other things, Sarah, you mentioned in the podcast, and I'm going to keep on referring to the gym because I listen to your podcast when I'm in the gym and I'm normally like half dead when I'm listening to it. Is I was on the rowing machine, which I hate with a passion, but I was there. Sarah's keeping me company now and is making sure that I don't completely lose my head. You were talking about existing in the present, and when we were talking about things from the past and kind of leaving the past behind and all that, and just saying, John, these things happened and things like that. One of the things you'd often see is, there's a meme that does the rounds, and I only saw it again today, is it was saying, the person that I have the least in common with is the version of me who wrote my Facebook posts 8 or 10 years ago and things like that. We all have a situation whereby, out of nowhere, some extremely embarrassing thing pops into your head and you're going, oh my God, how in the name of God did that happen? And I'm always reminded of there was an interview with Tom Hardy a couple of years ago. Someone found his like old MySpace or Bebo page or something like that, and there was these ludicrous pictures of him like as a young teenager, and like he was posing in front of a mirror in his boxer shorts and all this kind of thing. And they were trying to take the piss out of him. They were trying to say, "Oh, like what were you thinking? Looking when you look at these pictures now, what do you think?" And it was brilliant. His response was, he kind of turned around to me. He kind of said, well, I look at that and I see a picture of a young man who thought he was the lion in that picture. And you know what? He was the lion. And that's the most important thing. And he very much owned that embarrassing kind of situation. So I'm curious, when you think back on some of your embarrassing situations you might have come across in life, do you own it? Or do you go, do you know what? It happened. It was awkward. It was absolutely horrifying. Looking back, and it gives me red face. How do you deal with those situations?
That's a great question. I've never been asked that, nor have I actually thought about it, to be honest
Oh
with
my
you.
God, there's your next podcast episode right there,
There
Sarah.
we
Look at it,
go.
we've done it. Oh my God.
You did. Um, yeah, that's a great thing to think about. I would like to say I would have the grace that he did in saying that, I see this, but I'm thinking of, and I for sure did. I mean, I've asked all my friends from university to take down all the pictures of me on Facebook already because there's like just all over the place, just like drinking and debauchery and like just like all this kind of stuff. But even as I think of them, there's always a part of me that like gets a little like cringy inside. But it's also, I mean, look, I look at who I was 4 years ago, and that person is so different than this person that's sitting across from you today. But the thing is, without that person then, this
Yeah.
person wouldn't exist. And so there's so much, I have so much grace and forgiveness for myself because, like most of us, I've made so many mistakes. I've made so many mistakes in my life, big ones, little ones, across the board with friends, with loved ones. Like I speak, my biggest thing is just unconditional love. Like my biggest thing is to be the biggest beacon of love. And yet sometimes to be that biggest beacon of love, it means you have to hurt somebody, And it's like, it's not just one or the other. And so I think what I'd like to, when some picture of me pops up, inevitably, I'd like to think in that moment, I'd be like, you know what? She was just trying her best right then and there. And without that best, this best wouldn't exist. So,
Because as you said, it's so important to remember that with like there's a line from Star Trek Five where Captain Kirk says like I need my pain like if I went back and changed all the decisions if I turned left when I should have turned right and all this basically they're going without my pain it makes me who I am, and it's always important to kind of remember that for good or for bad these things happen. You wouldn't be the person you are today without them as well.
yep.
Now, I'm glad I got to challenge you with one question, Sarah. I was hoping I'd find something I'd be able to ask you
You did
that
it.
you weren't
You did
able to.
it.
Sarah, what is the Mitich ripple effect?
Yes. So it's kind of what I was talking about earlier of I've always wanted to save the world in like a very big dramatic way. Honestly, like I wish I could heal people like Jesus did. I wish that I could have these powers to like put my hands on you and any ailment you have disappears. But that's not me. Not in this lifetime anyway. Um or at least not yet. So we'll see. But so the ripple effect is how I've told myself I can do that. Because if I can better, and bettering your world, like the word better, I mean, what is that even? Sometimes the things that hurt us the most are the things that are better for us. So if I can inspire you to choose love more than you choose fear, to choose kindness and hope instead of reactivity and negativity, if I can inspire you to take one day to dig deep into yourself and ask yourself some of these questions like, who am I? And why am I not who I want to be? If I just do that to just you and nobody else, but then that gets you to just do that to one other person, and it gets them to do that to just one other person. That's what I call the ripple effect of I can only affect so many people right now. But if I can inspire at least just one person who continues to inspire somebody else, who continues to inspire somebody else, I believe that that intention, that love, that positivity will ripple out into the world, however it's meant to. So that's the way I've come to terms right now with knowing in my heart of hearts that I'm having the greatest impact I can have.
And Sarah, in terms of your podcast, then, what do you feel makes your podcast stand out?
I don't know. I don't think about it. Like I don't think about like what makes it unique. And, I had some people like help me with the branding and like the business side of it. And all that, the only reason it can stand out is because it's me. And
Yeah.
there is nobody else like me. And it's my story. Nobody has my story. And I have been through a lot in my life. And I don't say that through victimhood. Like I really don't. And if people can see themselves in the grief of my father dying very young, in the grief of my ballet career gone, in the grief of canceling my own wedding, in the grief of all the mistakes I've made. If they can see, it's the same thing, I guess, I'm realizing now as my acting, right? If people can see themselves in me and relate to them and be like, woo, if she could do it, I can do it. That's all I really want. And so I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's like, that's the only thing that can make it stand out, is that it's me and there is no other me.
I think, like, listening to the podcast, there was a lot of things you said that I completely related to, and then other things that I didn't necessarily relate to. But what was important is, as you said yourself in the podcast, like, this is what works for me. It may not work for you. And I thought that was so important because in your podcast, you're extremely honest and upfront. And again, you're unashamedly you, which is the most important thing. There was a line that kept popping into my head when I was on the exercise bike this time, listening to and I hate the exercise bike so much.
Just
And
sounds like you hate everything about the gym.
I know, yeah. But see, the good thing is Sarah's keeping me company now in the gym, so I can hate it and listen to something positive at the same time. And it is basically, if we're to be damned, let's be damned for who we are. And that was one of the things that came across as I was listening to your podcast, and I very much kind of appreciated that your warts and all, the podcast is you, and it's nobody else but you.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, it's that, right? As human beings, we want to express ourselves. At the end of the day, we want to express ourselves. How we do that is different for everyone. But it's like, at the end of the day, we want to do what we love and we want to express ourselves. And it's like, that is the freedom for me of the podcast, is it's like, here's me. And I'm, especially season 1, there was like, after a few episodes, I'm like, am I doing this right? Like, am I doing this how I want to do it? Like, what am I supposed to be doing here? How is this supposed to feel? Like, I don't know. Like, especially solo episodes, right? Like, when it's just me talking in front of this microphone for 30 minutes, I'm like, oh, okay, cool. This is not always what I thought it would feel like, you know? But it is. I think and I'm glad that is making the message of take what works, leave what doesn't, because I think that's so important. Like, look,
Yep.
I've read so many self-help books, personal development books. I've taken the courses. Like I said, like, read the Bible, I should know how to pronounce this. I don't, like the Bhagavad Gita, which is like the book in yoga that we study of Lord Krishna. And like, I've read it all, not all, but a lot. And sometimes I like latch on to certain things. And I'm like, no, this is the concept that's going to give me salvation. And then it's like, not, it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for me. And so I think it's so important, because when you latch onto other my whole point with the podcast is get you thinking about who you are and who you want to be. And so I don't want people necessarily just to do what works for me. I want people to find what works for them, because my version of me, my best self, is different than your best self. And so it's like, my biggest thing is to, spike everybody's curiosity a little bit, and maybe just spark passion, or give them that spark of inspiration to start asking themselves those questions. So I'm glad that's making it through, of like choose your own adventure.
And when you're doing the podcast there, do you just free form it on the spot, or what do you do exactly? Because I was really curious about that when I was listening to it. This time I was on some machine where I was stretching the back of my calves, which I don't actually hate. I actually like that one. But I was listening away to it, and I was there going, I wonder if Sarah read off a script, or does she just have notes in front of her, or does she just free form it?
Yeah, so honestly, a little bit of everything. My very first episode, I just spoke, but I think I recorded it like 30 times. Like, I would like craft kind of what I wanted to say. And like I said, I'd already written a book. And so a lot of the thoughts I'd put, like, they'd become cohesive.
Yeah.
But the other ones, I didn't fully script, but I was like, what do I want to talk about at least? Because I just realized in the solo episodes, like, there's a lot less editing if you can kind of have some kind of structure to it. And then season 2, when it comes to the interviews, I have like certain questions, as you probably know, that you want to ask a guest. But with some guests,
Yep, sure do.
exactly.
There it is, right there.
There it is. With some guests, it's kind of like free for all. Like, we maybe get to one question and then we just start jamming about things.
Yeah.
And with other people, it's very much like measured. I'm like, okay, we got to get to the next one. And like, here we go. Or there's certain things I really want them to talk about, right? Like, there's certain reasons why I'm bringing them on the show. Like, upcoming, like I interview a neuroscientist, a computational neuroscientist, and there were certain questions I really wanted her to answer in terms of like brain health and like positive thinking and just like the correlation of those things in her scientific studies, because that is something I can't provide people.
Yeah.
I can't provide them always with the science-based data. Like I don't have it.
Yep.
And I don't really have the desire to learn it in that capacity, right? Like I'm sure there's a lot of scientific thesis out there of like gratitude and what it actually does on like a cellular level. And I've read bits and pieces, but I'm not an expert on the science part of it. I'm an expert on the experienced side of it,
Yep.
right? And so yeah, and now when I do solo episodes, because I do them every now and then, just when I feel inspired, I'll make little notes. And to be honest with you, usually it comes from my journal entries of that morning. Like it's usually something that I'm mulling over because I think about things a lot and I write things out a lot. And so usually episodes will just come from like a philosophy or like a thought that I have or that I've like implemented.
And Sarah, it'll be, because we're a Star Trek podcast, is obviously it would behoove us to at some point ask you
Yes.
about Star Trek. You said earlier you were more fantasy and books than kind of anything else. So I'm going to take a wild guess. You mightn't have been the biggest Star Trek fan growing up. Would that be about right? No, never even heard of
Yeah.
it. I still don't even know what it is now, to be honest with you.
You know,
Star
yeah, no, I didn't.
Trek?
Yeah. No, I didn't. I wasn't raised on it. I didn't watch it. I mean, I've always heard of it. I'd probably like seen the movies and I'd seen certain episodes. You know what I mean? Like I knew of all the iconic characters, but it wasn't a world I was familiar with at all.
And how did the job come up initially?
I mean, I auditioned for it. We kind of like I semi knew it was Star Trek, but it always has code names.
Yeah.
So they don't actually like release what it is. And I auditioned for it. It was like 2 pages of like pure techno babble. And it was like, random character names. I didn't know what the character was that I was auditioning for. And I went in, I did the audition. And then the casting director got me to do it like 10 different ways. Like it was obviously like a bridge scene of some sort. But she's like, okay, that was great. Now let's do it like you're super confident and cocky and you're right. Good. Now let's do it like you're super inferior. Good. Now let's do it like the world is blowing up around you. Great. Now let's do it super quiet like you're like in a closet. Like I made that last one up, but a million different ways of doing it. I remember leaving that audition exhausted. And I mean like exhausted. I was like, "Oh my gosh." Also just like the vocabulary, like I have a good memory. Similar to Shakespeare. I was like, "Okay, but the thing is with this, I couldn't ask questions. Like I didn't know what some of the technobabble meant. I
Yeah.
had to sub in my own definition, which that's when memorization gets hard when I don't have the answers to it. In an audition, you don't have the opportunity to ask. You can't jam it out with the writers. You just have to make it up. And so yeah, so I left the audition and I was like, I don't even know how that went. Like, I don't know if I wasn't doing what they wanted me to do or if they were just like testing my range. Like, I have no idea. And then I didn't hear anything for like 2 weeks. I didn't even have a second audition. My agent just called me one day. I was driving on the highway and she's like, hey, you booked this. And by the way, it's Star Trek. And I was like, what? A, I booked it. B, I was like, oh gosh. Okay,
Hang on.
great.
You booked me in this audition. The poor person didn't have a clue what they were doing. I spent 9 hours in various scenes.
Yeah, it was pretty wild how fast and how, I mean, easy. Was it easy? No, but like it was so fast for me because there was no other callback. There was no, meet with the team, go to network. Like they didn't even like pin me or avail check me. It was just like, boom, here's the offer.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, great. I mean, no complaints at all. Please, universe, love it, bring it. But like it was an interesting thing for me.
So was that for Arium?
Yes.
What that became
Yes.
Arium?
Yes. So I knew because it said in the breakdown, like, must be okay with prosthetics and da 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 da, all that stuff. And I was like, cool, I've never done prosthetics. Sure,
Why
great.
not?
I'm like, why not? Again, because I love physical transformation. I love that. Arium was awesome because it was such a blending of my theater and my film. Doug Jones was the biggest crutch for me on this. He taught me how to, because I was like, I gotta act through the mask. I gotta like do this. And he's like, no, you act with it. You act with, like, you gotta learn and you gotta act with it. And it was like the most profound statement he gave me, because I was just like, I'd done mask in theater and I'm like, you gotta push through, you gotta make everything bigger. And I'm like,
Yeah.
how do I make everything bigger when the camera's right here though? You know? And the only thing that really moves is my eyes and kind of my lips, but they weren't even my lips.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, Ariam, she was such a gift. I mean, for so many reasons, right? For so many reasons, but it really allowed me to explore like this melding of the two industries, which was so cool.
And let's face it, there's no one better than Doug Jones to give prosthetics advice.
Bless that man. He is, honestly, he is one of a kind. He is, yeah, we could do a whole hour on Dougie.
Well,
I'm
hopefully we might be able to at some point.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure everybody we've spoken to in our Discovery series of interviews, if the name Doug Jones has been referenced, everybody speaks in such wonderful, polite, loving
And Sonequa.
tones about him. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Oof. Yeah.
In terms of like, what was the makeup like for Ariam, like in terms of the prosthetics as well? Like,
Yeah.
how long did it take to put on and take off?
Well, okay. So at the beginning of season one, it was, we were still getting used to it. So it was like you had the mask piece, the main one, but then you had like the head, neck piece, and then you had the lip pieces, and you had eyebrow pieces, then you had like the helmet on top, different ear pieces. And so it was so many different pieces. I remember the first time, my first day on set, I think it took 5 hours to put on. My call time, I think, was 2 a.m., 2 or 2:30, and we had to be ready for 7:30.
Word.
And yeah, it was a lot. By the end of the season, I think we got it down to like 2.5, 3,
Okay.
if I'm remembering properly. But because at first it was so, and each time we did it was a new set. They never reused
Hmm.
any of the silicone
Right.
because it was just so much better for my skin to remove it with oil and not alcohol.
Right.
But it was a long process. And I mean, for me too, I was pretty much on a liquid diet only because I couldn't eat any food because it wasn't my lips.
Yeah.
So it was like, which was interesting because it's like I was on a liquid diet, but then I actually started losing some weight. So then they had to make new costumes as like the first season went on. It was that first season was a lot for so many of us, right? Like not just cast, but
Yeah.
crew, like all the departments. And it's this big, there's so much pressure, right? I imagine, like, I don't know, but I imagine even like all the department heads, like it's Star Trek.
Yeah.
Hmm.
There's like a
And it's the
level of
first Star
expectation.
Trek in a long time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
Sarah,
So
when you were sitting in the makeup chair for 5 hours and all that kind of thing, what would you do with your time like? Because obviously we've spoken a lot about mental health and meditation, yoga and all that. Would you sit there and kind of do some form of meditation or yoga during it, or would you be chatting away to people all morning?
both. Honestly, both. Depends on the day. Um, those super, super early call times, I think for the first 2 hours, everybody's pretty silent. And I'm just like eyes closed, half asleep. Um, I remember to get the silicone, right? You have to go for a cast
Yep.
of you. That was an exercise in meditation that I was anticipating, but it was very, very fascinating because they put like the silicone mold over, right? And like I can only breathe through my nose. And everything goes over my eyes, it goes over my ears, so I can't hear anything, I can't see anything. And they do layer after layer. And so the whole process took about an hour, but I thought it was 4 hours because they booked me for a 4 hour chunk. So I was like, I'm gonna meditate for 4 hours under the silicone thing where like I can't see anything, I can't hear anything. So like it was easier because I anticipated 4 hours, which maybe that's like the key, like prep yourself for something like that. But yeah, so they do the 2 layers of silicone and then they put the plaster on, like paper mache.
Yeah.
This was a cool thing to witness my body. Again, separation of like mind and body of I was totally calm. Even though it's like every layer, everything got darker. I was totally calm. And then they put the paper mache part on, and I remember them going over my mouth. And the only place I could breathe is my nose, but then all I could smell was the glue.
Oh
And
God.
even though mentally I was like, hey, you're fine, my heart I started sweating like immediately. And they could notice, I guess, my elevated body temperature because they started like doing the check-ins of like, are you good? And I'm like, no, I'm good. But like, I could feel that panic
Yeah.
start because my body thought my nose was going to get covered up and I wouldn't be able to breathe. But it was totally fine. And so they did it. And then when they were taking it off, it literally, because they were just like, you have to break it, but it's all attached. It's glued onto me. So I was like, oh my God. Like I thought like my collarbone was going to break. Like it was so interesting and just so fascinating, the technology, right? But that was definitely out of the whole thing, that was my greatest test of like keeping calm in meditation because my body literally went into like fight or flight panic
Yeah.
mode, being like, we're about to die. But it was obviously totally fine. I'm still here. But yeah, in the chair in the mornings and stuff, it was, yeah, it just depended on the day.
And how did you feel leaving the character of Ariam behind and taking up the new character, Nilsson, after that?
Yeah, look, like it was amazing and it was super cool. I loved Ariam so much, but when they offered me this other one and they were like, it's going to be your face, it's going to be, you know what I mean? Like there is a slightly egotistical part of me that was like,
It's you.
I don't need to spend 3 hours in the prosthetic chair every morning. And so, but the thing is, I had no idea where Nilsson was going to go. Like they didn't tell me anything. I didn't know how many episodes. I didn't know she was going to replace Ariam. Nobody knew that till like the episode beforehand. They were very, naturally, they were very like strict with like showing scripts and
Yeah.
storylines and things like that. So I had no idea. But it was cool. It was super cool to be able, I mean, it's super cool. That's the beauty of sci-fi is you can play two different characters, right? Like I think for an actor, like that is, look at David, who's played, a bunch of different, or Ava Blackwell has
Yeah.
played so many different characters. And it's like, it's so cool to have that ability. And I'll always be very grateful, truly like very grateful for the opportunity to have done both.
Just on a personal level,
Mhm.
how did it feel knowing that Nilsson was replacing Ariam? Because this is a character that you created essentially, very personal to you. That whole first season, it's you, and then halfway through season two, they're gone and you're taking over. How did you deal with that?
So when they told me, they called me and told me, I cried. Honestly, I cried because I was like, what a cool I just thought that there was so much to her
Yeah.
that we wanted to know. And I'm glad that we got some answers in that episode, but there was still so much I wanted to know. And I thought she was a really cool character.
Yeah.
Am I grateful I got back on the bridge? Yes, I will say that. The bridge is just like my favorite place. It's
It's the
so cool.
bridge. I mean, come on.
Bridge. Yeah. But do I wish that both could have coexisted together somehow? Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
And when you look back on your time on Discovery, Sarah, what were some of your favorite moments on and off the screen?
Mm. On screen will always be our episodes with Rainn Wilson. I can't, like, that man is a genius. And he would throw us things while we were filming. We'd have to like cut because he would just turn to Doug and call him something like, I don't know, like giraffe or something. But like we're rolling. And like both Dougie and I, it's like we can't laugh very easily with these prosthetics. And so on screen, yeah. I mean, there's so many, but that's the first one that
Mm,
popped up. The second thing that pops up on screen is when I think it's episode 3 of season 3, where we all go to Earth and we go back
Yeah.
and
mm,
we're all with like the tree and we're just sitting there as a family. Like there was something filming that was really, maybe it's because we got, on location. And even though we
yeah.
love the bridge, like to be able to go somewhere and have that experience was really beautiful. Off screen, I mean, the bond, the musicals. you have no idea how many musicals we have created off screen on that bridge, led by the impeccable Doug Jones. But like we had so many moments as a family because the hours were long.
Yeah.
Some days, like some days we're filming till 7 a.m. on a Saturday, and we're all getting loopy, and we're all, and it just, the things that happen in the wee hours of the morning were just, they're just so memorable. But yeah, all the singing, all the dancing off screen, and just the bond. Like we'd always have game nights too, sometimes on weekends and stuff. Like and that's Sonequa, right? Sonequa taught me how to be a number one. I had been a number one before, but she taught me how to be a number one that I want to be in every respect. That woman, if it wasn't for her, the set experience of a show of that magnitude would be very different. And so I'm forever grateful, not just for her friendship and bond and love, but like what she taught me as an actor, as a woman, as somebody who wants to do this and lead in this.
Yeah.
The grace and the compassion, but the professionalism and the discipline blows my mind. Really blows my mind.
I think what everybody we've spoken to from Discovery, I think Doug and Sonequa's names are always mentioned so prominently. And what I'm really always delighted to hear is the vibe and the connection that everybody had off screen as well. It's always great to know that like the on-screen chemistry is actually replicated off the screen then as well. And Sarah, in terms of say the Star Trek fans, because Star Trek fans are exceptionally passionate about Star Trek, how do you think that they've kind of connected with you and how you've connected with them?
That's a great question. Yeah, the Star Trek fans it's a family. I remember my first convention, Star Trek Las Vegas, way back when. I'd never done a con before. And so it was like the big one to go to. But there's
Yeah,
like
of all the
everybody
ones you
came.
could have done first, Vegas.
Yeah, it's like that was, no warm-ups. But I remember so many fans, like my table, we try to always get them at eye level, but the table was lower. Some fans like literally just like came down on their knees and they were like, "Hey, welcome to the family. We love what you're doing. Like, thank you so much." And they wanted to be eye level, which meant a lot for me because I wanted to be eye level too, right? But a lot of them, have just been so responsive to both characters, especially, Ariam and everything that she went through, and especially when we learned her story
Yeah.
and all of that. And so it's really great. I mean, the fans, I was so scared at first. If I'm being honest, like I was so scared because I was like, they're gonna hate me because I didn't grow up on Trek. And like I had 4 weeks from the time I was cast to like when we started going to camera, maybe 5. And so I tried to watch as much Star Trek as humanly possible, but there's only so much you can retain. You know what I mean? Like before like it starts to get very overwhelming. And so I was so scared about all of it. But they were so welcoming. I mean, they are just so welcoming because that's the show.
Yeah.
The show is going to call in like attracts like, right? The show is so welcoming and accepting and open and explorative. And so it's going to bring those people into it. And so they've always been so lovely. And I've always felt so comfortable just being me and not trying to hide certain parts of me or like, I'm just like, hey, this is me openly and honestly. And they all love it because they are saying the same thing.
Sarah, if it makes it feel any better, you do know that the guy who wrote and directed Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, did not grow up on Star Trek either and was not a big fan of it until he was forced into a position where he had to watch them all in an extremely short period of time. So you're in good company there in that situation. And Sarah, if you look back and say the 4 years you had on Discovery and the show is ending now and things like that, what do you kind of think about your kind of time on the show?
Oh, that's a great question.
Oh, we've done it, Mike. We got 3 great questions. We've done it.
You have
We
a
got
lot
the
of great
3.
questions. You really do. I love questions like this. My time on the show, the biggest thing about it, look, it launched me to a world I didn't necessarily know I'd be a part of. And that world in itself, honestly, has opened a lot of doors. Of course it has. Career-wise, personally, everything, right? But at the end of the day, the work is the work and I'm grateful for it. But it's the people. It's the people, honestly. On and off screen, like just the family, the communion, the camaraderie, like that for me I will always take that to every set that I go, because it taught me that if you can support each other on the off,
Yep.
you can effortlessly support each other on the on, right? But also just like the development of all of us as individuals. If I think back to who I was when I started Discovery, to who I was when it ended or ending, it's like that journey alone. And it's always beautiful, right? Because the characters also reflect a journey that the actors are going on. I'm sure Sonequa would say the same thing, who she was and who she is now. And so, but it's the family that I take with me the most.
And if you had a chance to come back to Star Trek as Nielsen or a different character, would you take it?
Totally. Totally. I think there's so much more to explore, and like, and why not? You know, like if all the same people are back with me, especially, yes, absolutely. But there's a lot of questions I still have that I want answers to.
Yeah. And I think there's a perfect place for Nilsson in Starfleet Academy. But there we go. Tilly's
We shall see.
example.
Sarah, we have 2 questions asked for you. First, where do people find your podcast?
They find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. But also, I mean, my Instagram handle at Gratitude Growth Podcast will shoot you to the link tree there as well.
We'll link that in the bottom or in the description for this video.
Thank you.
Then the final question. This is a really easy question. You won't have to think about it at all, I hope. Sara Mitich, what does Star Trek mean to you?
Family. I mean, I know I just said that, but that's my immediate family. Family and exploration. That's it. I mean, look, Roddenberry, a lot of, some of the most spiritual texts I read, thank him ahead of time.
Yeah.
Because he's always had that curiosity to explore. And it's not just exploring space, it's exploring humanity.
Yeah.
And so I've never, and I don't think I really appreciated or noticed that till like season 3 for me. When I realized, I'm like, oh wow, I'm going through all this growth as a human, and this show is reflecting that right back to me. And so family and exploration.
That's awesome. Sara, thank you so much for coming on this episode. For everyone watching or listening at home, remember to check out our website, Clonestar Pod, for amazing fan art, blogs, and our new and improved merch. Until next time, live long and prosper.